Welcome to Canadian Justice. I'm Christine Van Gyn. Prime Minister Trudeau has announced that he is resigning and a Liberal leadership race is underway to replace him. Now that Trudeau has made his intention to resign clear, it's a good time to look back at how he will be remembered, especially his legal, constitutional, and civil liberties legacy. In announcing his planned resignation, Trudeau also announced that Parliament would be prorogued. This term of Parliament is going to be ending, it's going to be on a break. What does that mean for the bills that were, until now, working their way through the legislative process? Here today to discuss all of that is Canadian Constitution Foundation's Executive Director, Joanna Baron. Joanna, thank you so much for joining me today to talk about this. Now, I want to start with Trudeau's legacy. And I think the broader question is, how should we think about his legal or constitutional legacy to the extent that he has one?
Yeah, so Justin Trudeau is not exactly a constitutional scholar, although he's been a very effective politician. And so I don't think there's like an overarching narrative or thread to his legal legacy. But if I were to identify two things that sort of mark a lot of the actions that he took, one is this sort of, I would say, soft social justice ideology that comes out in things like the Cannabis Act and his response to allegations of genocide, but we'll get into those things. And the second is really, and this is true of almost all politicians, just political expediency, what he thought was necessary at the time to stay in power.
Now, I think that you brought up he's not a constitutional scholar, and one of the things that's really interesting is of course his father, Pierre Elliott Trudeau, he was, and I think that there's this expression that history doesn't repeat itself, but it rhymes, and I think that one of the things that Trudeau Jr. is always going to be remembered for is actually one of the same things his father is going to be remembered for, which is abusing emergency legislation. In his father's case, in Pierre Elliott Trudeau's case, it was the War Measures Act. In Junior's case, it was the Emergencies Act. So, what do you think of that? Do you think that's going to be a part of his legacy? That's what I think.
I mean, absolutely. He was the first politician to invoke the Emergencies Act in its history, which of course was drafted to replace the War Measures Act. And the funny thing is that in both cases of both men, I would say they're equally shocking. But it's just fresher in our memories, not just that he invoked the Emergencies Act, but that he took punitive measures like freezing bank accounts and cracking down on peaceful protests. And then, in my opinion, he essentially lied when he testified, or at very least, he twisted language to justify and twisted the language of the Emergencies Act to defend his invocation of it when clearly the government did not have the requisite justification or evidence to meet that very stringent test.
Now, of course, this is an issue that you and I are sort of seized with, since we both are with the Canadian Constitution Foundation, which is the charity that brought that successful legal challenge to Justin Trudeau's invocation of that emergency legislation. But I just wanted to update viewers. There is an appeal underway. What can you tell us about the status of that appeal?
So that will be heard in early February over 2 days at the Federal Court of Appeal in Toronto. And our lawyers, Sujit Chaudhry, Janani Shanmuganathan, and the whole team, we're working very hard on it. And we're really prepared to respond very forcefully to uphold Justice Mosley's federal court decision and preserve the precedent that the government cannot invoke the Emergencies Act unless it is truly a tool of last resort, as was not the case during the Freedom Convoy.
Yeah, absolutely. And we're certainly going to have some episodes of Canadian Justice about that appeal. Now, you've written an op-ed in the Hub, and one of the themes that about Trudeau's legal legacy, and one of the themes that you talk about in that op-ed is his legacy of online censorship. And Justin Trudeau had not just one, but three pieces of legislation that were introduced on the topic of online censorship. We've got to go to commercial break, but I'm just going to set this up for the next segment. And those three pieces of legislation were the Online News Act, the Digital Streaming Act, and the Online Harms Act. And each of them has sort of really different and broad and specific implications for the right to freedom of expression in Canada, they all kind of ended with at different stages. But I do agree with you that that is going to form a core part of Justin Trudeau's legacy, this regulation of speech on the internet. When we come back from break, I want to get into all of that. Welcome back to Canadian Justice, where we're talking about Justin Trudeau's legal legacy. And I'm joined with the executive director of the Canadian Constitution Foundation, Joanna Baron. And Joanna's just written a fascinating column in the Hub. I encourage everyone to go and read it. It's about what his legal legacy is. And one of the big themes emerging in that op-ed is his hostility to online speech and this desire to regulate and censor the internet. And there's sort of three big pieces of legislation that Trudeau had introduced on that topic. Joanna, what can you tell us about that and how that's going to be a way that Trudeau's remembered?
So first I'll mention the two that are unfortunately in our view already law. The first is the Online Streaming Act, which became law in 2023, and this is the bill that regulates the internet and mandates YouTube and TikTok and other platforms to feature more Canadian content through this mysterious algorithm which is going to mandate discoverability of Canadian content and creators such as yourself. You are the host of the most popular YouTube channel on Canadian constitutional law, and you actually do not benefit from this because you have to be approved by the regulator. And there's a lot of discretion that basically bureaucrats can decide what content I see when I log into my YouTube page. And then second is the Online News Act, which also was passed in 2023. And that's the one that requires Google and Meta to compensate legacy news sites. And that's resulted in millions in lost revenues with canceled deals, reduced traffic for Canadian media sites, not to mention the impact it has on smaller media startups such as the Hub.
Yeah,
and then finally, sorry, and then I'll mention the Online Harms Act, which you've talked about a lot, we've talked about a lot, which is going after so-called content that foments hatred and other types of content and putting huge obligations on platforms to get rid of this content, which could lead to a huge chill effect and blocking of protected content. Happily, that is not law, and the bill has had a tumultuous path through the House. We hope that it's dead, but TBD.
Yeah, Joanna, you actually testified at Parliament about that specific piece of legislation, which it looked like it was a large part of it was already dead on arrival. The government had already abandoned some parts of it, but they had kept this censorship, the online censorship, this bureaucracy they were planning on creating, the Digital Safety Commission that was going to order taking down of certain types of content and ability to issue fines for content that foments hatred online, a notoriously squishy concept of what actually constitutes content that foments hatred. So it is a positive development that that law seems to now be dead thanks to the prorogation. But look, the censorship is one thing, and that's a big part, I think, of what Trudeau's legacy is going to be. But another part of his legacy, and maybe people in the West will relate to this more, but I think and in Quebec, frankly, but I think a big part of his legacy is actually the hostility to provinces and the desire to use the federal government to reach into provincial jurisdiction and meddle in provincial affairs. Now, our Constitution has a clear division of powers, and there have nevertheless been a number of cases where the Trudeau government has overstepped that division of powers and meddled in the province's business. What can you tell me about that?
So first and most famously is the Greenhouse Gas Pollution Pricing Act, also called the carbon tax, and this is obviously central to our discourse. It is the centerpiece of Pierre Poilievre's campaign, Axe the Tax. But there were serious legal problems flagged with this from the outset. The federal government purported to present it on the basis of the federal peace order and good government power, but it clearly constituted going into provinces and dictating their jurisdiction over property and civil rights. And it really inflamed provincial tensions decisions. Unfortunately, though, the Supreme Court upheld it 6-3. There was another sort of doubling down, though, in 2019 in the form of the Impact Assessment Act, or also called the No More Pipelines Bill, which mandated federal oversight of huge infrastructure projects on the basis of everything from Indigenous rights to health and gender, and would allow the federal government to basically delay or indeed veto major projects indefinitely. And that is the case that the Canadian Constitution Foundation intervened at the Supreme Court level. And we were very happy that a 5-2 majority of the Supreme Court rejected this, which was really a blatant and unconstitutional power grab.
Yeah, that law, which I think a lot of people may know as the colloquial term, the No More Pipelines law, allowed the federal government essentially to veto things that were entirely within one province. So we're pleased with that result from the Supreme Court that found that was unconstitutional. We've got to go to break now, but we will be right back. Welcome back to Canadian Justice, where I'm joined by the Canadian Constitution Foundation's Executive Director, Joanna Baron, and we're talking about Justin Trudeau's legal legacy. Now, Joanna, you've written about this, and you've made this point that the expansion of medical assistance in dying or euthanasia might also be one of the ways that Trudeau's remembered. But it didn't start out this way. It didn't start out with this sort of rapid expansion. It actually started out quite a different way in response to a decision by the Supreme Court that was made under the Harper government. But then things kind of went off the rails. What can you tell me about all that?
Yeah, so of course things have completely gone off the rails, so much though so that in the debates around the UK's recent decision to legalize assisted dying, the word Canada was like a shibboleth that we don't want to become like that. So I don't deny that at all. However, it was my view at the time, and it remains my view, that the government's first legislative volley in the form of Bill C-14, which was responding to Carter, the Supreme Court decision that overturned limitations on euthanasia. That was a bill that was brought by Minister Jody Wilson-Raybould with the assistance of a friend of mine, Jessica Prince, and it really was a cautious and serious first step. It limited the availability of medically assisted death to people whose deaths were reasonably foreseeable, and it came short of the Supreme Court's dictum that physician-assisted death should be available to anyone suffering from grievous and irremediable harm. They really took conscientious objections, and at the time they took the slippery slope arguments seriously. We know that the train left the station on that anyways, but I still think they did a good job with that first attempt.
Yeah, and then things quickly kind of went in a different direction when the Quebec government, in a case called Truchon, decided, I mean, they overturned the initial attempts on a more restrained approach to euthanasia. And the federal government chose not to appeal that case. And now we're left with repeated expansions of who can access medical assisted death or euthanasia, up to attempts by the government this year to expand that to include people suffering solely from mental illness. Now, they did end up saying we weren't ready for that expansion quite yet, but things really accelerated under this government in access to euthanasia are made. And I do think that that's going to be a part of how Justin Trudeau is remembered. Now, another thing that you point out in your op-ed in the Hub about how Trudeau's legacy will be perceived is that he agreed with this concept that Canada is a genocide state. And I don't know if I'm paraphrasing his words because it's such a kind of shocking assertion, but maybe you can expand on that.
Yeah, so this is in the context of the 2019 report of the Inquiry into Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women and Girls. And in their final report, they famously accused the Canadian government of committing genocide against Indigenous peoples. And then when you get into the substance, they say that this was a cultural genocide. They're not literally saying that the Canadian government killed these individuals, but they say it's related to domestic abuse, alcoholism, all of these tragic social conditions that we know very sadly are are predominant in some Indigenous communities. And so this label of genocide was immediately rejected by our leading human rights luminaries like Romeo Dallaire, who of course was in Rwanda, Erwin Kotler, but Trudeau adopted this language, and he finally capitulated at a public opportunity and said, we accept the finding of the commissioners that it was genocide, which led to some awkward interactions at the international level. And I'm not sure he really understood what he was endorsing when he said that.
Yeah, kind of an unfortunate piece of the legacy. It's not all dark though. There are a few bright spots that you point out. Why don't you tell me about one of them?
So one thing that I will make the case was a positive thing that Trudeau did very early on in his when he was still in his sunny ways era was bring in the Cannabis Act, which legalized recreational use of cannabis across the country. I think Canada gained a first mover advantage from being the first G7 country to do it. We were able to build up major cannabis corporations. There were also just rule of law issues with the fact that there was this sort of detente that it was understood that you weren't going to be enforced against for personal possession or for smoking cannabis in a park. Now, there's no doubt that we live in Toronto, and it's not uncommon to be walking down the street and smell marijuana, or for people to be smoking marijuana in parks where there are children. But I think on the whole, this was the right move, and it allows law enforcement to focus on more serious criminals.
A good point, Joanna, and I wish they would focus on more serious criminals. We got to go to break, but we'll be right back. Welcome back to Canadian Justice, where I'm joined by the CCF, the Canadian Constitution Foundation's Executive Director, Joanna Baron. We're talking about Justin Trudeau's legal legacy and his decision to prorogue Parliament. So, Joanna, now that Parliament is prorogued, this means that the pieces of legislation that were working their way through Parliament, they are essentially dead, or almost certainly dead. One of the legislative changes, though, that is very confusing to people is this increase in the capital gains tax. The Trudeau government had announced that it was increasing the tax to a incredible 66.6%, but that proposal actually never made its way through Parliament. But despite that, it seems like the CRA is already implementing it. Can you explain to our viewers what is going on?
Yeah, so it's a very bizarre situation. The proposal never made it past what's called the Notice of Ways and Means motion stage, which basically means the corresponding legislation was not introduced or debated upon. But we looked into this, and it's actually normal practice in Canadian tax law for new proposals to take effect immediately to prevent different types of abuse, even before they're confirmed in the House of Commons. And the CRA said that it would continue to apply the proposed increases even if an election is called. But at the same time, they quietly released guidance to tax advisors that they weren't going to actively enforce it. And I think that this just reflects the fact that the Conservative government has vocally said that they're opposed to the tax hike. So there's a very good chance that the proposals will never be passed, which is a huge relief. And you can just imagine the administrative chaos if the CRA was forced to then issue billions of dollars in refunds. So for now, it looks like they're officially saying it will be enforced, but privately saying hold off.
I mean, what a mess and what a confusion for people, especially small business owners who might be faced with some capital gains if they, buy or sell a business this year. Now, one of the consequences of prorogation, as I said, is that it kills bills that were making their way through Parliament or through the Senate. And I am shocked when I read about some of the bills that were going through the Senate. Some of them are pretty out there, like a Senate bill on universal basic income, a Senate bill on mandatory healing lodges for prisoners on request, some additional changes to medical assistance in dying. What can you tell me about those kind of oddball bills and where they stand?
Yeah, so we talked about advances in MAID, and for the most part, the expansion of MAID has come from the courts. But in this case, Senator Pamela Wallin has proposed a bill that would even further expand the availability of MAID to individuals whose death is not reasonably foreseeable to make advanced arrangements for MAID. And it would allow individuals diagnosed with a serious condition to waive the requirement for final consent through a written declaration, which would be valid for 5 years. I think both of these proposals present serious problems for abuse. Senator Kim Pate proposed a universal basic income bill. The odd thing with this is that universal basic income is usually proposed to sort of replace the welfare state, but here Senator Pate specified that all existing entitlements would remain in force. So basically just doubling state entitlements. I don't really understand how that works. And then finally, also from Senator Pate, there is a bill aimed at incarcerated individuals, which would expand the availability and also mandate judges to grant all requests for Indigenous incarcerated individuals to be transferred to healing lodges. The problem with that is that healing lodges have been known to have many escapes. Their security has been lacking. And so I think greatly expanding their availability, unless it's a really clear case, like a low risk offender, for example, seems like a recipe for disaster.
Yes, I certainly agree with you. And it seems like those are all dead now, thanks to the prorogation. Joanna, that's all the time we have. I want to thank you for coming on to talk about this. It's always fun to think about how someone will be remembered, for what their legal legacy will be. So thank you so much.
Thank you.
We've heard today about the civil liberties and constitutional legacy of Prime Minister Justin Trudeau. How do you think this Prime Minister will be remembered? What law, policy, or government act stands out to you as the best or the worst? You be the judge. Thanks for watching, and remember, a freer Canada starts with you.